Hi everyone, I'm Shea. I'm from Flashbots, and today I want to talk about block building for rollups, and I kind of want to share a new idea that is inspired by based rollups but takes a sort of different set of trade-offs. A design that I think will help rollups both sort of push the frontier for UX and also materially advance decentralization in both their L2 sequencers and on the L1. So please hold. If you take anything away from this talk, this I think is the punchline really. I think that in our quest to expand and integrate the Ethereum ecosystem, there is one thing that's sort of been neglected, which is decentralization in block building, both in terms of increasing the robustness of block building on L2s and making sure that we preserve decentralization on the L1 in the process. And I think that creating a great decentralized block builder can solve for a bunch of different things that we care about in sequencing across L1 and L2. You know, real things that real rollup teams want today. Sorry, some difficulty with the clicker. So roughly, this is how the talk will look. And and I want to start by sort of setting the scene a bit. So next. So why are we here? Why are we talking about sequencing? Well, I think we're here because we want to expand and integrate the Ethereum ecosystem to create the sort of united chains of Ethereum, to steal Justin's meme. And we want to scale Ethereum's values like decentralization through its rollup, so how they implement their sequencer is a big part of this. We also want Ethereum to be useful, both its technology like its sequencing layer and potentially its token. And having rollups, use these things is a great way to do that. And finally, I think we want all these things that extend Ethereum to work together to create a sort of great ecosystem. We want L2s to go off and experiment with a range of ideas that kind of push the frontier on things like better UX and apps, while finding ways to sort of integrate and compose them together to create a coherent ecosystem, to give users a seamless experience and maximize the value that we can create through coordination with things like interop or shared sequencing. Next. And I think the big challenge we face, obviously, is that centralized sequencers are maybe not a great way to get there. They're a lot like Web 2 apps. They have great UX, but they miss some of the key benefits, I think, of crypto, which are resilience and composability. Next. So next, I want to briefly talk about some of the ways we've been thinking, obviously, about upgrading centralized sequencers to be robust and composable. And I know this crowd is already really familiar with these designs, so I'm going to speed through it a bit. And I really just want to use this exercise to focus in on the one piece that I personally think is maybe missing or underrepresented in our current picture. From my personal vantage point, coming to this from the world of MEV and of block building. Next. So, as you all know, right, a major proposal for making rollups more robust and composable is called based rollups, where the L2 uses the L1 proposer set to sequence their L2 blocks. Next. And this has a bunch of advantages, obviously, over centralized sequencers. The L1 controls their sequencing, which means that rollup inherit things like liveness and resilience of the L1. It also turns the L1 into a shared sequencer, which is really great for interop and things like that. Next. But one of the points of rollups is to create a seamless UX and sort of experiment with the trade-offs to attract users. And by being just a pure based rollup, that maximally inherits the decentralization of the L1, that can be in tension with this goal. So from a UX perspective, based rollups, obviously, they inherit the sort of slow 12-second block times of L1. It's harder to use custom sequencing logic if you're based, and transactions don't get privacy by default. Unless you trust a third party today, there's no way to keep transactions private before they land on chain on Ethereum, which means your users could get front run, get worse prices. And based rollups also sacrifice both MEV revenue and control over how this revenue is redistributed, which is actually kind of a big deal because smartly redistributing your MEV can be really valuable as a tool for kind of attracting and retaining apps to build on your rollup. I know some folks are of the opinion that MEV will go to zero, but I think if you actually go and ask rollup teams today, not just base rollup teams, but rollup teams in general, they will say, no, I do want to have control over my MEV. And also, you will notice that innovating on redistribution is one of the key things that some of the newest rollups today are prioritizing. Next. So I think you get this sort of trade-off matrix where the better composability and robustness of based rollups comes at a trade-off against UX. And I think that if we want rollups that really push the frontier on great UX and apps, we have to offer another way, another point on the trade-off curve. Next. So this is where pre-comps come in, based pre-comps, where users can get very fast economic commitments that their transaction will be included in the next block. Next. And I think this fixes, obviously, some of the UX limitations with regular-based rollups, so users get fast confirmations. And most of the designs today actually have a sort of separate party that facilitates these pre-comps, so you can use that party to actually enforce things like privacy. But I actually want to double tap on that last point, which is where I think this gets interesting. Pre-comps are something that is naturally going to be outsourced to a third party. This is a sophisticated task. You need to handle pricing. You need to quickly merge huge numbers of roll-up transactions, which lightweight L1 proposers can't really do if we want them to remain dumb pipes, per Vitalik's meme. And I think it's also pretty clear you want the pre-comp to be private. So for the same reasons we don't share unsigned blocks with untrusted proposers today, we want pre-comp transactions to also be private. And so you need a very sophisticated and trusted actor that operates outside of the L1 proposer set to handle all of this, which sounds a whole lot like a centralized sequencer. So I think that basically under the hood, based pre-comps are just transferring sequencing rights from one centralized sequencer to another party that will also be highly centralized because of the sophistication and trust that's involved. You have much more of a centralized dependency for your block building process on L2 as a result of this. Next. And I think this is also something that has implications for the L1. A big issue that I personally have with based pre-comps is that they reinforce and accelerate centralization on L1. So the need for privacy means that the pre-comps transactions are effectively a new source of exclusive order flow on L1, which I expect will exacerbate all of the order flow wars that we already see on L1 that are highly centralizing. Also, the sophistication required to provide pre-comps will just further entrench the most dominant L1 builders. Especially if you're pre-confirming many domains, this really balloons the complexity and makes the pricing challenge harder. Pricing future value of state is a hard thing to do. And then finally, I'll just add a note that most of the designs today use a centralized relay in some way to kind of mediate the interface between the proposer and the pre-comper, i.e. the builder, which is a choke point for co-location. So this worries me a little bit. I think based pre-comps, the downside is that they entrench and accelerate centralization in the L1 block building market. And somewhat secondarily, they basically just kind of swap one centralized L2 block builder for another centralized pre-comper / block builder. Okay, which leaves us here. We have Web 2 properties in centralized sequencers, so great UX, but maybe not much else. We have UX limitations in the purely based rollups, and our best alternative to that right now, which is based rollups, improves UX, but does this at the expense of robustness on L1, and I think also doesn't dramatically improve it on L2. I recognize this is fairly simplistic. You do get a couple of extra benefits with based pre-comps for your L2, but I think that's a far cry away from the ideal state. And so I want to talk about an idea about how we might get closer to that ideal state. This is an idea, not a panacea. I'm not about to go put a row of green check marks at the bottom here. I just think it's a different point on the trade-off curve that should be part of this discussion, especially for rollups that really want great UX and great robustness, maybe are okay accepting some trade-offs around composability. So here's a proposal, a design that helps us sort of expand and integrate the Ethereum ecosystem while also materially increasing decentralization in the way blocks are built on L2s, retaining or maybe even improving decentralization on L1, and doing this all in a way that gives rollups sort of the freedom to push the frontier in great UX and great apps. So if you know me or you have talked to me at some point this year, it will probably come as no surprise that I think a big unlock here is in developing a great decentralized block builder. Block building is the part of the sequencing stack that is closest to the user with the most material impact on apps and UX. And it's also kind of at the heart of a lot of the problems in MEV and centralization risks. I think that by taking a much more targeted approach and a look at this part of the stack, we can get somewhere really exciting for rollups for Ethereum. Next. Okay, so what makes a great block builder? Well, I think really it's three properties. A great block builder will be private to protect transactions from front running. It'll be fast, so it can handle latency sensitive use cases, give users a great UX, and decentralized to both maximize coordination across a bunch of parties that don't trust each other, and also to prevent things like censorship, rent seeking, and capture from degrading your long-term user experience. And we've been calling this the MEV trilemma, how to get all three of those properties. It's a bit of a trilemma. There's a longer talk about this from ECC also, if you're curious. But I think the punchline is that it's really hard to build this. It's really hard to build something that's fast, private, and decentralized. And so until kind of recently, we only had these partial solutions. But the good news is that this year, there's somewhat of a breakthrough. So you've probably heard us at Flashbots talk a lot about trusted execution environments. And if you're not familiar with these, TLDR, hardware manufacturers like Intel will manufacture machines that have really strong privacy and integrity guarantees. And this gives you a couple things. You can encrypt data to an enclave that's on the machine, and that data can't be leaked, not even to the person operating it. You can also attest that a specific piece of public code and only that code is running. So together this means that anyone can run software like an MEV auction, like a block builder, without compromising on security. And this, I think, kind of solves the MEV trilemma, makes it possible to safely distribute block building all over the world across a lot of different operators. To take a quote from Phil's talk at Devcon earlier this week, Ts let you distribute power to the edges. And it also works in practice. This isn't just theory. We've been running builders in Ts for something like 6 months on L1. So that's the idea. But what does this actually look like? Like, how can you visualize this? Please enjoy my amazing graphics. One way to visualize this is that there are many TEs all around the world that each can run specific code with a sort of verifiable rule set. They do this on entirely private transaction data, and they can coordinate. So they can share transactions with each other. They can build on each other's work. And I think this setup, this decentralized distributed network of TEs, gives us a bunch of really interesting things for rollups. Gives you a highly available, highly robust network of nodes that you can outsource sequencing to. Even makes it possible for other teams to run your sequencer, so you're kind of resilient to faults in your own infra. It also helps you create a sort of credibly neutral, more censorship-resistant platform for users to trade on, because lots of people are involved in potentially building each block, so the platform as a whole isn't really subject to one person's compliance needs, which is really important for things like you want to create fair capital markets. And you can also kind of enforce whatever business logic that you want, which is where a lot of the cool innovations in UX lie. So redistributing MEV to apps and users, or preventing failed transactions from spamming your chain, taking up a bunch of useful block space. Running all this logic in a TE will give you really strong guarantees about what's happening without even having to be the one who runs the sequencer. And we actually have a version of this on L1, and it's pretty easy to just plug your L2 into it. Insert your own business logic and get this geo-distributed network of TEs to securely run it for you. And I'm calling this built rollups as a play on based rollup. So L2s that are sequenced by a decentralized off-chain block building network that also can power the L1. And what's nice about this is that not only does this make your rollup sequencer a lot more robust, it also could create a sort of positive feedback loop between the L1 and the L2. So plugging more rollups into this network creates an incentive for more TE operators to join it. And you could go get those same new TE operators to also sequence L1 blocks, to also sequence other rollup blocks, which then makes L1 block building and really block building across the Ethereum ecosystem a lot more robust. So you get this kind of nice effect where the more rollups there are, the more robust the network becomes, and the more valuable it becomes to kind of participate in the Ethereum ecosystem. It's kind of like the opposite, I think, of based pre-comps, where and the more rollups you add to in base pre-comps, the sort of greater the centralizing pressure on the L1, but built rollups flip that a bit on its head. And what's cool is that, while we're all using the same underlying infrastructure, these geo-distributed network of TEs, you can do this without being locked into the same business logic. So you don't have to inherit things like the 12-second block times of the L1. Cool. So this is where I think we end up. You do get much better properties in terms of robustness and UX, and then you get something in the middle when it comes to composability. I'm putting this in red because it's obvious that a built rollup won't be able to match the sort of strongest form of interop that a based rollup can have. But I've left it as a question mark because a built rollup does have some new properties and advantages that regular centralized sequencers might not. So I think it could be kind of interesting actually to explore things how maybe TE proofs or verifiable rule sets could be used here. And I'll kind of leave this question with you all. And also leave you with one small plea, which is that in our quest to sort of unify Ethereum, we don't forget the decentralization of the L1. I think scaling Ethereum is a really cool opportunity to reinforce, to strengthen its values and to kind of multiply them across a bunch of other chains. And I think we should really interrogate the protocols we're designing to make sure that they actually do this and they don't just like hide a centralization vector under another name. I think we should also go after those centralization vectors in the supply chain today and actively design systems that decentralize the concentration of power in them, like with block building. This is just one idea, it's a bit of a shower thought. First time I'm really articulating it here today. Would be very interested to see what people think, and I hope to see more ideas like this too.
We have time for a Q&A if anyone has questions.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, are there any documents or links with more like technical specifications for this built roll-up approach?
I wrote this presentation within the last 24 hours, so no. But we do have a bunch of stuff about TEs, about TE block building, and soon TM within the next couple of weeks, something about how you can actually coordinate a network of different TEs to build blocks together. So there will be more written content soon.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, how does this idea integrate with something like Suave? Is like Suave built on top of this, or is it completely separate?
Yeah, so I think this is one way you can use Suave. A nice way to think about Suave is really a decentralized geo-distributed network of TEs that have certain guarantees around privacy, integrity, that we hook up all the low-level stuff like attestations and make sure that it's easy to just take any kind of business logic that you really want to decentralize for a certain reason and deploy it on this network. And your L2 sequencers may be one example of business logic. And I see Suave as kind of, this platform that a bunch of these different things can be built on top of, yeah.
Would it make sense to have some blocks built with certain sequencing strategy and some other blocks built with built sequencing, and the user choose which type of trade-offs they are willing to pick, depending on what type of they get to choose how they want to be sequenced?
Interesting. I've not yet heard of a rollup that wants their users to choose the sequencer. I don't know if anyone's building that. Could be interesting. I think the nice thing about built rollups is you can kind of choose your own business logic. What they're really providing is the infrastructure to run this in a really geo-distributed, decentralized way. And we have, there are rollups that are experimenting with different kinds of MEV redistribution, rollups that are experimenting with a bunch of different things. I think it's kind of a choose your own adventure, yeah.
Okay, another question. How do you envision this decentralized network working? Like, is it going to rotate from TEE to TEE, or is it going to run some sort of a consensus protocol between all of them?
Yeah, so one thing that's kind of nice about TEs is like you don't need consensus for everything. You know exactly what the other nodes in the network are doing because you know exactly what software they're running. You can verify it. I think I'm mostly focusing on the block building part, which is like specifically the way that bundles or transactions are merged together to produce a block. There is obviously this question of, if you want to do things like sequencer rotation or leader election, I don't think they're totally incompatible, but the part I'm really focusing on is like the block building process itself, which is where I think a lot of the centralization vectors end up being, yeah.
Doesn't decentralized block building increase latency and therefore decrease the UX as opposed to improving it?
Great question. Okay. I think there are a couple interesting things here. First of all, with TEEs, there are versions of TEEs today that we have been running for 6 months with basically no impact to performance. So there's not a huge latency impact from that. I think then there's this question, obviously, of, well, I have this like geo-distributed network of things all around the world. Won't that be slower than just having one big box? And I think the answer to that question really depends on the distribution of order flow and the distribution of your validator proposer set, whatever it is, around the world. If you think about L1, it's actually quite interesting. If you have a fully decentralized validator set on Ethereum, their location is essentially a random point in the world. And then if you also have a really geo-decentralized set of where order flow is originating from, where is the closest point between those two things? It's also a random point. So actually, a block builder that has this ability to be all over the world there's this hypothesis that we call the negative latency hypothesis, which is basically that will actually be faster than some centralized choke point because you have the ability to essentially be co-located wherever the next important source of order flow is or important validator is. I think with L2s this gets a little funky because as you shrink the window, the latency of your blocks, there might become a point at which you want to be more co-located in a certain region. But I think it's actually pretty contextual. It depends on the distribution of other things, if that makes sense.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. My question is, how do you reconcile the fact that a large cryptographic community don't like TEs, but you guys are pushing TEs because is this the only solution that you found? Especially there are a lot of side channel attacks on TE that keep coming, and nobody seems to address them.
Yeah, great question. Okay, I think there are a couple parts of the question. One, is this the only thing we've found that works? For the problem I described, for this MEV trilemma problem, the answer is today, yes. This is the only thing we've found that works because, software cryptography would be really great if we could use it. We're doing a bunch of research on it, but it's still too slow. And basically everything else just only gets you 2 of the things you want, and you want all 3 of speed, privacy, and decentralization. So yes, I think the other part of your question is there's all this FUD about TEs. How do you respond to that? What do we do? I maybe similar to the previous question actually. I think it depends how you apply them. TEs are really good at doing certain things, and they're really insecure if you want to use them for other things. Block building is a really nice use case because it has certain properties. The window that we need the security for is really short. We're not doing things like long-term key storage. And a lot of the hacks I think you've probably heard about are for people using TEs for things more like that. So block building is kind of unique. And also when it comes to things like, I think you mentioned side channels, leaking information. Side channels like a way to leak information from the TE to kind of exploit the privacy properties. And what's interesting is most of these attacks really depend on having physical access to the hardware. And one of the things you can do, which is not maybe the most secure long-term solution, but works really well in the medium term, is you can run them in a cloud. And then what you have is, okay, people are able to own and operate these TEs, but they don't have physical access to the hardware. And you also get this nice property where if you have, both a cloud operator and the hardware manufacturer for your TE, then both of them have to collude to do certain kinds of exploits. You get this other layer of defense, and you can imagine that their incentives are not perfectly correlated, so you get that kind of extra degree of defense in depth. Obviously, I think the final thing to say here is these on a 5 to 10 year time frame. We're doing a bunch of research to remove the actual roots of trust in them. So trustless or zero trust TEs is one interesting line of research. and also find ways to like augment them or replace certain pieces with things more like software crypto. So it's an ongoing process, but today I think they're pretty good actually for the specific things we're trying to do with them. Yeah.
Shea, it sounds like you're Shea. It sounds like you're using the T's though more for integrity than privacy here, right? So a lot of the exploits, side channel exploits, some of which are remote, by the way. If you don't use T's together with oblivious RAM, then there are ways of trying to infer information from access patterns to memory. But those are all related to privacy. Like it's very hard to extract a key from a TEE remotely. So is it fair to say that like in ways in which you're using TEs are more for integrity than privacy?
I think actually we do want privacy. I mean, you want privacy in block building for super obvious reasons, right? You want it because you don't want people to get front run. You want to be able to let, imagine like you want to let an untrusted party run, you know, a sequencer against all of your users' pre-trade information. Like, yes, you definitely want integrity, but you also want privacy for that. Otherwise, you know, it's like you're just sending everything to a public mempool. People are going to get sandwiched and stuff. So I do think you want both, which is why we are concerned about side channels, obviously, and running things in clouds and doing research. There's actually some new stuff like ORAM. I think it might be working in TDX now, which is pretty cool. So yeah, doing a lot of work on that.
All right. Oh, one more question, and then because we're going to have a lunch break, so one more question.
I know you put like a red sort of thing on composability, but is it possible this has better properties for composability? I guess one advantage of doing this is you can have the same TE validating very different sequencing rules, so like solving the conflicts. So shared sequencing, there has to be like a lot of crossover between the sequencing rules, but it seems like this could be something that can solve like very arbitrarily different rules together.
Yeah, I put it as a question mark because I think it's kind of interesting. I think it's not the same, you don't get the same guarantees you get with a based shared sequencer. Like that's really nice. But yeah, it does seem, it's definitely better than just having a bunch of independent centralized sequencers that don't talk to each other. I think one of the cool things also is like you just have this integrity guarantee. You can have a bunch of custom business logic, and then you also know exactly what every domain using this is doing. You can use T proofs and all sorts of interesting things. So yeah, I think it's a cool question mark. This is my attempt to nerd snipe people to think about it.